Hey everybody, this is a piece by Steffen Klävers, or Kleffers, is probably how you say it in German. Let's look up who this person is, huh? Steffen Klävers. It looks like Steffen Klävers has a book titled Decolonizing Auschwitz? Question mark. I'm not really seeing any description of it. Yeah. Okay. It looks like he works for, is affiliated with, Jewish Forum for Democracy and Against Anti-Semitism in Berlin. The piece that I'm reading today is titled Paradigm Shifts, Critical Reflections on the Historikerstreit 2.0, the Catechism-Debate, and their Precursors. Yeah. Wikipedia says the Catechism Debate, also known as Historikerstreit 2.0, is a debate in Germany about Holocaust remembrance initiated by Australian historian A. Dirk Moses with his 2021 essay, The German Catechism. In the debate, Moses challenges the uniqueness of the Holocaust. In May through August of 2021, scholars reacted to Moses' thesis in The New Fascism Syllabus in a series of reflections started by Jennifer V. Evans. It says, Dirk Moses' article, The German Catechism, was published in May 2021 in the online journal Geschichte der Gegenwart, The History of Today, and republished in English on the website New Fascism Syllabus. The article outlines the, quote, German Catechism, end quote, as including these 5, quote, creedal, end quote, beliefs. 1. The Holocaust is unique because it was the unlimited Vernichtung der Juden der Vernichtung willen, parenthesis, exterminating the Jews for the sake of extermination itself, in parenthesis, distinguished from the limited and pragmatic aims of other genocides. It is the first time in history that a state had set out to destroy a people solely on ideological grounds. 2. It was a civilizations book, parenthesis, civilizational rupture, in parenthesis, and represents a break with the moral foundation of the nation. 3. Germany has a special responsibility to Jews in Germany and a special loyalty to Israel. Quote, Die Sicherheit Israels ist Teil der Staatsräson unseres Landes. End quote. Parenthesis, Israel's security is part of Germany's reason of state, end parenthesis. 4. Anti-Semitism is a distinct prejudice and was a distinctly German prejudice. It should not be confused with racism. 5. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Moses argues that going through a process of internalizing and confronting Holocaust exceptionalism was an important phase in the politics of memory in post-Nazi Germany that arose from historiographic, presentational, and cultural breakthroughs in the 1980s, especially in the United States, and eventually migrated into German consciousness in the 21st century. However, according to Moses' argument, this way of situating the Nazi final solution in relation to other genocides and mass violence has become an impediment to thinking and investing in global justice and security, because it makes slippery distinctions between what happened in the death camps and what happened in, for example, the colonies of the global south during the period of European and American imperialism, what happened to Native Americans under the regime of Manifest Destiny, and can be an impediment to thinking clearly about the problems which now confront us in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And real quick, I want to look at the Wikipedia for Holocaust uniqueness debate. The assertion that the Holocaust is a unique event in human history was important to the historiography of the Holocaust, but it has come under increasing criticism in the 21st century. Related claims include the claim that the Holocaust is external to history, beyond human understanding, a civilizational rupture, and something that should not be compared to other historical events. History. The Jerusalem School of Jewish History originated in the 1920s, and it sought to document Jewish history from a national as opposed to a religious or philosophical perspective. It developed the notion that Jewish history itself was unique, a progenitor to the idea of the uniqueness of the Holocaust. The uniqueness of the Holocaust was advanced while it was ongoing by the Jewish World Jewish Congress (WJC) but rejected by governments (which?). That's from the editors of Wikipedia of countries in German-occupied Europe. In the early decades of Holocaust studies, scholars approached the Holocaust as a genocide unique in its reach and specificity. Holocaust uniqueness became a subject for scholars in the 70s and 80s in response to efforts to historicize the Holocaust via such concepts as totalitarianism, fascism, functionalism, modernity, and genocide. In West Germany, the Historikerstreit, quote, historians dispute, end quote, erupted in the late 1980s over attempts to challenge the position of the Holocaust in West German historiographical orthodoxy and compared Nazi Germany with the Soviet Union. Critics saw this challenge as an attempt to relativize the Holocaust. In the 1980s and 1990s, a set of scholars, including Emil Fackenheim, Lucy Davidovitz, Sal Friedländer, Yehuda Bauer, Stephen Katz, Deborah Lipstadt, and Daniel Goldhagen, mostly from the field of Jewish studies, authored various studies to prove the Holocaust's uniqueness. They were challenged by another set of scholars from a wide diversity of viewpoints that rejected the uniqueness of the Holocaust to compare the Holocaust to other events, which was then met with an angry backlash from uniqueness supporters. It seems like a charged statement. Around the turn of the 21st century, polemical approaches for the debate were exchanged for analytical ones, relating to claims of uniqueness in Holocaust memory. In 2021, there were few scholars who are still making the uniqueness argument. Unlike most Orthodox Jewish rabbis and theologians, the Lubavitcher Rebbe eventually came to the conclusion that the Holocaust was historically and theologically unprecedented and could not be understood with older religious categories such as sin, punishment, or tikkun. In the 21st century, an increasing body of scholarship challenged the claims of uniqueness proponents. While Holocaust scholars have largely moved beyond the uniqueness debate, belief that the Holocaust is unique continues to be entrenched in public consciousness and moral pedagogy in the West. In 2021, A. Dirk Moses initiated the Catechism-Debate, challenging the uniqueness of the Holocaust in German Holocaust memory. The same year, in his book, The Problems of Genocide, Moses argued that the development of the concept of genocide based on the Holocaust led to disregard of other forms of mass civilian death that could not be analogized to the Holocaust. Arguments. Proponents of uniqueness argue that the Holocaust had unique aspects which were not found in other historical events. Historian Daniel Blattman sums up the uniqueness position as arguing it was the quote, only genocide in which the murderer's goal was total extermination of the victim with no rational or pragmatic reason, end quote. But Blattman and other scholars say this is not true of the Holocaust either. For example, historian Dan Stone writes that Bauer's definition of, quote, Holocaust as, quote, total destruction, end quote, unlike all other genocides in history, is mistaken because in the Holocaust, destruction was not total. Opponents argue that since every historical event has unique features, uniqueness proponents are in fact making ideological rather than historical claims. German historian Wolfgang Benz argues that 6 million victims alone makes the Holocaust, quote, a unique crime in the history of mankind, end quote. On the other hand, historian Annette F. Tim argues that the Holocaust was unique due to the categorical rejection of any single Jewish person from being assimilated. Critics of the uniqueness concept have argued that it is Eurocentric. Some Holocaust scholars who support uniqueness concept deny other genocides, such as the Romani Holocaust and the Armenian genocide. Some observers claim that the Holocaust was influenced by the earlier Herero and Nama genocide in South German West Africa, while others reject the comparison. The German historian Jürgen Simmerer has critiqued both German liberals and German conservatives who do not see, quote, continuities, end quote, between the Namibian genocide and the Holocaust, claiming that conservatives have an unwillingness to examine German colonial history and that liberals have a, quote, fear of challenging the dogma of Holocaust uniqueness, end quote. Christian Gerlach argues that putting the Holocaust above other atrocities involves, quote, constantly devaluing and demoting all other victim groups, end quote, which he calls racist. Okay, so I think that's enough to just get us started. Just wanted to get the juices flowing. Anyway, the abstract for this article says, taking up central arguments from the recent Historikerstreit 2.0 debate, this article seeks to elucidate the question of whether the Holocaust can be understood with terminology usually used to describe the histories of imperialism and colonialism. It will situate the current debate in relation to past debates on similar questions and analyze the key arguments from one of the protagonists, Dirk Moses, by drawing on his most recent publications. So here we go. Here's the actual article. The question of how to connect the historiographies and memories of Western colonialism with those of National Socialism and the Holocaust lies at the core of what is so hotly debated in the so-called Historikerstreit. Footnote. Several key arguments in this article have been formulated in my book, Decolonizing Auschwitz, Comparative Postkoloniale Ansätze in der Holocaustforschung, published in 2009. End footnote. In an oversimplified summary of the complex political historical debate, one could say that while one side argues for integrating National Socialism and the Holocaust within a global imperial/colonial framework, the other side argues against such an understanding because of certain peculiarities associated with National Socialism. It is above all a debate about questions of uniqueness and continuity, of universal structures and specificities in a simultaneously post-colonial and post-national socialist world. This article seeks to achieve two things. Firstly, to provide an overview of the current debate and its origins. Although the intensity of the debate could give the impression of a novel conflict, this feature is continuous with more than 20 years of animated academic discussion about the possibilities of connecting post-colonial studies and Holocaust studies. The second objective is to discuss a specific aspect of the debate from one of its key texts, namely Dirk Moses' much discussed essay, The German Catechism. In this text, Dirk Moses argues, among other things, that the Holocaust could be described as an example of a regime seeking to achieve, quote, permanent security, end quote, that had not been unique to National Socialism, but instead represents a, quote, common pattern in world history, end quote. That just seems just like off the bat, just to sign it for myself, just talking out loud, just seems like outright ridiculous. In terms of threats to National Socialism, there was far more pressing threats than international Jewry, which the Nazis hoped to exterminate in total. Anyway, Moses' plea, which he describes in greater detail in his new book, The Problems of Genocide, published in 2021, is to shift the standard explanatory paradigm, from explaining the Holocaust with particular reference to anti-Semitism, to one in which imperialism and colonialism occupy a more prominent space. The description of A. Dirk Moses' book, The Problems of Genocide, Permanent Security, and the Language of Transgression says, genocide is not only a problem of mass death, but also of how, as a relatively new idea in law, genocide organizes and distorts thinking about civilian destruction. Taking the normative perspective of civilian immunity from military attack, A. Dirk Moses argues that the implicit hierarchy of international criminal law, atop which sits genocide as the, quote, crime of crimes, end quote, blinds us to other types of humanly caused civilian death, like bombing cities and the, quote, collateral damage, end quote, of missile and drone strikes. Talk of genocide, then, can function ideologically to detract from systematic violence against civilians perpetrated by governments of all types. The Problems of Genocide contends that this violence is the consequence of, quote, permanent security, end quote, imperatives, the striving of states and armed groups seeking to found states to make themselves invulnerable to threats. Back to the text. Finally, as Moses also claims in his essay, the idea of the Holocaust's uniqueness, and the Holocaust representing a, quote, Zivilisationsbruch, end quote, parenthesis, civilization or rupture, end parenthesis, were two elements of a new, quote, catechism, end quote, administered by, quote, self-appointed high priests, end quote, who at the same time perceived the operation of comparing it to other genocides as, quote, heresy, end quote. Dirk Moses, The Problems of Genocide. No, shit, no, that's not what it's from. That's from the German Catechism. I want to start my article by delving into the question of what it means to treat an event as unique, and whether or not uniqueness excludes the possibility of genuine comparison. Singularity and comparison. From the semantics of the term Historikerstreit 2.0, one could argue that the current debate at least stands in some relation to the Historikerstreit 1.0, the momentous German historical debate from the 1980s with which it has been compared. While one could indeed see structural similarities, the content of the two debates is not the same at all. In the 1980s, Ernst Nolte questioned the, quote, originality, end quote, of Auschwitz by identifying a causal relation between Soviet gulags and National Socialist extermination camps, thereby implying that National Socialist extermination camps was a reaction to the Gulag. And as an operation which, according to Ernst Nolte, amounted to a, quote, Asiatic, end quote, a, quote, Asiatic, Jesus Christ, a, quote, Asiatic, end quote, deed, end quote. Ernst Nolte, 1993. and that is related to an article by Ernst Nolte titled "The Past That Will Not Pass: A Speech That Could Be Written But Not Delivered." End quote. Published in Forever in the Shadow of Hitler, original documents of the Historikerstreit, the controversy concerning the singularity of the Holocaust, edited by Ernst Piper, translated by James Knowlton and Truett Cates. The description of this book says, original documents of the Historikerstreit, the controversy concerning the singularity of the Holocaust, important both for the historical positioning of the concept of German national identity and also for an understanding of contemporary German politics. This collection of the primary documents that form the historian's debate, printed here in their entirety, in a complete English translation and without editorial commentary, will be compelling reading for historians, political scientists, Holocaust specialists, and Germanists alike. Okay, back to the text. You know what? Why not look up Ernst Nolte while we're here? Ernst Nolte, who lived from 1923 to 2016, was a German historian and philosopher. Ernst Nolte's major interest was the comparative studies of fascism and communism, comparison of Nazism and Stalinism. Originally trained in philosophy, Ernst Nolte was Professor Emeritus of Modern History at the Free University of Berlin, where Ernst Nolte taught from 1973 until his 1991 retirement. Ernst Nolte was previously a professor at the University of Marburg from 1965 to 1973. Ernst Nolte was best known for his seminal work, Fascism in Its Epoch, which received widespread acclaim when it was published in 1963. Ernst Nolte was a prominent conservative academic from the early 1960s and was involved in many controversies related to the interpretation of the history of fascism and communism, including the Historikerstreit of the late 1980s. In later years, Ernst Nolte focused on Islamism and, quote, Islamic fascism, end quote. Ernst Nolte received several awards, including the Hans Martin Schleyer Prize and the Konrad Adenauer Prize. Ernst Nolte was the father of legal scholar and judge of the International Court of Justice, Georg Nolte. Okay, back to the text. Already in 1980, Ernst Nolte noted, quote, "The Auschwitz is not primarily a result of traditional anti-Semitism, and was not just one more case of, quote, genocide, end quote. It was the foreborn reaction to the acts of annihilation that took place during the Russian Revolution. ... The so-called annihilation of the Jews by the Third Reich was a reaction or a distorted copy, not a first act or an original," end quote. Ernst Nolte. And that's from an article titled "Between Historical Legend and Revisionism, the Third Reich in the Perspective of 1980. And footnote. Ernst Nolte was challenged by Jürgen Habermas, who not only rejected Nolte's claim by accusing Nolte of trying to achieve a false sense of guilt, a guilt-free German past, but he also heavily criticized Nolte's attempt to contextualize the Holocaust as a, quote, reaction, end quote, to a threat, as well as Nolte's description of Auschwitz as a, quote, distorted copy, end quote, of a, quote, original, end quote. It also seems like there's an anti-Semitism. I mean, this is just a side note for myself. It seems like there's an anti-Semitism in, like, Nolte's claim. The idea that the annihilation of Jews is a respect to this supposed annihilationism that took place during the Russian Revolution. It seems like there's an idea here that, like, what is, like, being prevented or responded to is, like, it seems like what's being, I mean, I don't know, and this is a heavy speculation, but I feel pretty entitled to make it, is that what he's saying is that the Russian Revolution, in some sense, it could be argued that what he's playing on a theme of the Russian Revolution being a Judeo-Bolshevik revolution, right? A Jewish revolution, and that it's like a response to the annihilationism of the Jews who orchestrated, and obviously the Jews didn't orchestrate the Russian Revolution as Jews at the very least. Although Jews, obviously, like Leon Trotsky, for instance, were prominent in the Bolshevik Party, right? But this idea that it was I don't understand what the killing of Jews has to do with the Russian Revolution unless one thinks that the Russian Revolution is in some sense Jewish. Anyway, Habermas's criticism is of fundamental importance for the legacies of the historical strike, if one cannot actually speak of such. If one can actually speak of such. These legacies could be described as twofold. Firstly, the Historikerstreit is often remembered as being a debate on the possibility of how to historicize and compare the Holocaust. More importantly, there was a taboo in relation to the historicization of the Holocaust, especially the attempt to put it in a causal relation with preceding events. Secondly, Auschwitz was not a variant of already known structures, but something new, something singular. After all, Habermas observed, quote, Nolte reduced the singularity of the annihilation of the Jews to, quote, the technical process of gassing, end quote. ... The Nazi crimes lose their singularity in that they are at least made comprehensible as an answer to the still extant and Bolshevist threats of annihilation. The magnitude of Auschwitz shrinks in the format of technical innovation and is explained on the basis of the, quote, Asiatic, end quote, threat from an enemy that still stands at our door. End quote. Habermas. The thesis of a specific Holocaust singularity has dominated academics as well as a public discussion. Sorry, hold on. Let me look up this Habermas book real quick. Where the Habermas quote is coming from, at least. That Habermas quote is coming from an article titled A Kind of Settlement of Damages on Apologetic Tendencies in German History Writing from 1993. Well, maybe it wasn't published in 1993 originally, but it's in the edited volume from 1993 that I looked up earlier. Forever in the Shadow of Hitler. Original documents of the Historikerstreit, the controversy concerning the singularity of the Holocaust. Anyway, back to the text. The thesis of a specific Holocaust singularity has dominated academic as well as public discussions about memory politics and historiography ever since. However, debates on singularity began even before the first Historikerstreit. André Louvre claims singularity debates go back as far as 1941. It says André Louvre is currently deputy head of the Center for Holocaust Studies at the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich and teaches at Mannheim University. Dr. Louvre received her PhD in history from Ruhr University Bochum, 2005. Andrea Louvre has served as research associate at the Institute for Contemporary History since 2010, including conducting research of the Berlin office's Source Project, Jewish Persecution 1933 to 1945. From 2004 to 2007, Andrea Louvre worked on the research project Edition der Lodzer Ghetto Chronik, edition of the Lodz Ghetto Chronicle, with the University of Gießen. Andrea Louvre's main research interests are the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, Jewish history during the Holocaust, and the history of the ghettos. Okay, that was from the Holocaust Memorial Museum website. Back to the text. Andrea Louvre claims singularity debates go back as far as 1941. In an essay from 2012, Louvre provides a perspective on the singularity debate which is seldom taken into account, that of Jewish victims during the Holocaust. She presents several testimonies by Jewish civilians that describe the violence they witnessed as new and unprecedented in history. See Louvre 2012. And that refers to an article in German. The academic debate related to the Holocaust singularity is younger, however. Until the 1960s, the Holocaust was assigned the status of an incomparable and unique event, situated almost outside of history. This is, of course, a problematic understanding. No event can be situated outside of history and thus elude human understanding. Such an event would more closely resemble a scientific singularity comparable to a black hole, or a mystical event outside of space-time. Both accounts are inadequate for an objectively grounded political debate. Since the late 1960s, however, historicizing and politicizing National Socialism and the Holocaust became a more common practice, with the academic debate about singularity emerging from it. Footnote, see Rosenfeld, 1999. And that's the piece from Gabriel D. Rosenfeld is titled "The Politics of Uniqueness: Reflection on the Recent Polemical Turn in Holocaust and Genocide Scholarship." And I think Rosenfeld was who was quoted, who was where a lot of the research, a lot of the information in the Wikipedia came from. Anyway, and footnote, in the 1970s, the debates on Holocaust singularity focused mostly on the aspect of anti-Semitism, particularly showing how it differed in ideology and intent from other cases of genocide. Authors such as Saul Friedlander, Yehuda Bauer, and Lucy Davidovich in 1981 developed the first theses about a historical uniqueness of the Holocaust. Saad Friedlander is a Czech-born Jewish historian and professor emeritus of history at UCLA. And his book being referenced is titled "Nazi Germany and the Jews." No, excuse me. Some aspects of the historical significance of the Holocaust. I'm not seeing any particular good descriptions of this text. Moving on, Yehuda Bauer. Wikipedia says Yehuda Bauer lived from 1926 to 2024 and was a Czech-born Israeli historian and scholar of the Holocaust. Yehuda Bauer was a professor of Holocaust studies at the Avraham Harman Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And the book he is referring to is The Holocaust in Historical Perspective. Not really seeing any good descriptions of that book either. And then finally, Lucy Davidovich, 1981. Wikipedia says Lucy Davidovich lived from 1915 to 1990 and was an American historian and writer. She wrote books about modern Jewish history, in particular about the Holocaust. The book being referred to is The Holocaust and the Historians. The description for this book says, the renowned author of The War Against the Jews sets out to solve a historiographical mystery. Why has the mass murder of European Jews been overlooked or trivialized by historians throughout the world? In a forceful outspoken work, Lucy Davidovich looks for explanations. Again, the book was from 1983. Anyway, back to the text. In Yehuda Bauer's work, Whose Holocaust, from 1980, Yehuda Bauer defined the unique elements of the Holocaust as twofold. Quote, what makes it unique is the existence of two elements, planned total annihilation of a national or ethnic group, and the quasi-religious apocalyptical ideology that motivated the murder. End quote. Yehuda Bauer. Another influential interpretation of Holocaust uniqueness was presented by Steffen T. Katz, as it also included an understanding of what was not meant by the concept of singularity. Wikipedia says Steffen T. Katz, born 1944, is an American philosopher and scholar. Steffen T. Katz is the founding director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Judaic Studies at Boston University in Massachusetts, United States, where he holds the Alvin J. and Shirley Slater Chair in Jewish and Holocaust Studies. Back to the text. Katz rejected any theological conclusions deriving from the Holocaust or even religious explanations. Furthermore, any, quote, metaphysical claims, end quote, were not deemed relevant since there was no argument to be made for a, quote, transcendental uniqueness, end quote. Additionally, Katz criticized positions that claimed a certain psychological inability to comprehend the Holocaust by referring to such categories as, quote, the irrational, the pathological, the insane, end quote. Steffen T. Katz. And that quote is from The Holocaust in Historical Context, Volume 1, The Holocaust and Mass Death Before the Modern Age. And it says, in this volume, Stephen T. Katz initiates the provocative argument that the Holocaust is a singular event in human history. Unlike any previous work on the subject, the Holocaust in historical context maintains that the Holocaust is the only example of true genocide, a systematic attempt to kill all the members of a group in history. In a richly documented, subtly argued, and amazingly wide-ranging comparative historical and phenomenological analysis, Katz explored the philosophical and historiographical implications of the uniqueness of the Holocaust. After he established the nature of genocide, Stephen T. Katz examines other occasions of mass death to which the Holocaust is regularly compared, from slavery in the ancient world to the medieval persecution of heretics, from the depopulation of the New World to the Armenian massacres during World War I, and from the Gulag to Cambodia. In the first of 3 volumes, Katz, after seeing the groundwork for his analysis with 4 chapters dealing with essential methodological issues, begins his comparative case studies with slavery in the ancient Greek and Roman world, and continues with such subjects as medieval anti-Semitism, the European witch craze, the medieval wars of religion, the medieval persecution of homosexuals, and the French campaign against the Huguenots. Although this investigation of pre-modern Jewish and non-Jewish, throughout this investigation of pre-modern Jewish and non-Jewish history, Stephen T. Katz looks at the paths in which the Holocaust has precedents and parallels, and in what ways it stands alone as a singular, highly distinctive historical event. End footnote. Additionally, Katz criticized positions that claimed a certain psychological inability to comprehend the Holocaust by referring to such categories as, quote, the irrational, the pathological, the insane, end quote. Even if the deed in itself might seem hard to comprehend and even irrational, it still followed a perfidious logic, namely that of anti-Semitism. Finally, Katz rejected any historiographical mystification of the Holocaust as unscientific because, quote, uniqueness, end quote, did not imply that the causal relationships between historical events could not be understood. In a later paper published in the volume Is the Holocaust Unique?, Katz stressed that by arguing for the uniqueness of the Holocaust, he did not seek to diminish the horrors and human suffering of other events. In arguing for the uniqueness of the Holocaust, I am not making a moral claim. In other words, that the Holocaust was more evil than the other events discussed in this collection. For example, the murder of Armenians in World War I, the devastation of the Native American communities over the centuries, the decimation of Ukraine by Stalin, the treatment of the Gypsies during World War II, and enslavement and mass death of black Africans during the enterprises of New World slavery. I know of no method or technique which would allow one to weigh up, to quantify, and compare such massive evil suffering, and I therefore avoid altogether this sort of counterproductive argument about what one might describe as comparative suffering. I love that. Sorry, I have to copy that down. Come on, sorry, I know this is annoying. And that article, that quote is from Stephen T. Katz's article, The Uniqueness of the Holocaust, the Historical Dimension, in the book, Is the Holocaust Unique? Perspectives on Comparative Genocide, edited by Alan S. Rosenbaum. Okay, back to the text. It is frequently asserted that the uniqueness thesis prohibits comparison with other events, which, as we have seen, is also something A. Dirk Moses insinuates in A. Dirk Moses' Catechism text. In another central text of the Historikerstreit, Jürgen Simmerer and Michael Rothberg published an essay in the German weekly newspaper Die Zeit entitled "Abolish the Taboo of Comparison," in quote, exclamation point, in which Jürgen Simmerer and Michael Rothberg, I don't know if he's German or not, write, quote, "Das Verbot jedes Vergleichs und in Beziehung setzen führt zu einer Herauslösung der Shoah aus der Geschichte und hat weitreichende Folgen," end quote. Which translates as, quote, "Prohibiting every comparison and contextualization will lead to a removal of the Shoah from history and has far-reaching consequences," end quote. Simmerer and Rothberg. Shit. Come on. Where am I? Considering that what the above mentioned theorists of Holocaust uniqueness have stated about contextualization and historicization, this comes across as a rather odd diagnosis. To be sure, it is a kind of platitude to say that to define what is specific, one needs to compare. Footnote, to give just one example, Yehuda Bauer writes, quote, "In order to define the Holocaust, it must be compared to other events if it is ... a human event. It is only by comparison that we can answer the question of whether or not it is unprecedented and has features not found in similar events," end quote. Yehuda Bauer. One can certainly not speak of a taboo here. In fact, not one participant in the entire debate of the Historikerstreit has stated that it was taboo to compare the Holocaust to other events, and vice versa. Probably all of Moses's, Rothberg's, and Simmerer's critics have repeatedly agreed with them in this respect. In any case, the category of uniqueness is of central relevance to the current and past debates. The position arguing in favor of a Holocaust uniqueness was summarized in point 1 of the Catechism, where Moses states, quote, "The Holocaust is unique because the Holocaust was the unlimited Vernichtung der Juden der Vernichtung willen," parenthesis, exterminating the Jews for the sake of extermination itself, in parenthesis, distinguished from the limited and pragmatic aims of other genocides. It is the first time in history the state had set out to destroy a people solely on ideological grounds, end quote. A. Dirk Moses. This is a correct assessment in summary. I would add that Vernichtung der Vernichtung willen, extermination for the sake of extermination, is indeed a slightly problematic aspect of any uniqueness claim, as it diminishes the fact that there was a sense of means-end rationality in the Nazi crimes. The ideology of anti-Semitism followed a logic that exceeded that of, quote, extermination for the sake of extermination, end quote, especially since Jews were persecuted for being perceived as presenting a global conspiratorial threat. That's an important claim right there, a global conspiratorial threat. And I think, I don't know if maybe I'm reading too much in this, but that's one of the things, like, from my understanding, at least Nazi anti-Semitism was in a certain sense felt as though, maybe I'm wrong, maybe this is not true, but it seems to me, it appears to me personally, that the Nazis felt they were doing the world a favor in the extermination of the Jews. Anyway, carrying on. To add to this, I would be more interested in the specificities of the, quote, ideological grounds, end quote, than that a state acts solely on the grounds of such ill-perceived, quote, reason, end quote. Moses, however, fundamentally rejects such an understanding of uniqueness. Why Moses does so will be discussed below.